October 30th, we're back at 21 Soho with Ian Brodie talking about life in and out of the Lightning Seeds and John Higgs on the KLF. Tickets below.
Welcome to another edition of Word in Your Ear. Now, David and I have always been enormously fond of the pioneering Island Records label. Its artists, its sleeves, its folklore. In fact, it was the Island sampler, Nice Enough to Eat, that really opened up a whole new world for me. It introduced me to Traffic and King Crimson and Nick Drake. And now a sumptuous new book has appeared telling the story, there it is, of the first series of records that were released on Island between 1959 and 1968, appropriately 1 foot square, so that album sleeves can be reproduced pretty much actual size. And it has a wonderful title, The Island Book of Records. And it's edited by an old pal of ours who used to do press for Island Records, Neil Storey. Neil, lovely to see you, enviably in France.
Bonjour, as they say.
Bonjour. How are you doing?
It's actually
all right.
Quite nice to see you holding the book up, because we don't actually have printed copies. We've had our own copy printed locally, but that's not bound in the same way that yours is. So it's quite nice to see it with a real cover as well.
So the first, you don't even know the weight of it yet.
No, quite. So the first surprise for me was, good grief, this is volume 1. This is 1959 to 68. So how's it gonna work out going forward? Is it a second volume or a third volume or what?
And a fourth and a fifth and a sixth. Volume 2, we're actually underway on volume 2, which is 1969 to 1970.
Well, that's only just 2 years.
Yeah, really?
That's astonishing.
Well,
but then there was a lot out in those 2 years.
There was, and I haven't dared tell Emma, who's our editor at Manchester University Press, but she'll be horrified to learn that it's already at 440 pages.
Wow! So that sets the tone, really. This is very comprehensive. This is extraordinary. This is like being in a record shop of your dreams, going through this stuff. Because I speak to somebody who wasted most of my young life in record shops, and a great deal of this stuff I'd never seen at all. So it was absolutely extraordinary to see it all laid out in the way it is. So the best way to talk about this, it starts in the early days, obviously, in Jamaica. That's what it's selling, isn't it? That's what Chris Blackwell's Island label is selling, is the qualities of Jamaica. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I suppose so, in a funny sort of way, although I don't think anybody thought of it in those kind of terms at that time. It was more for, the first 4 albums, which are the 2 Lance Hayward, the Owen Gray and the Ernest Ranglin, they were only issued initially in Jamaica. The Owen Gray was brought in on import, or rather it was licensed to Starlight in the UK. Those are as rare as hen's teeth. They really, really are rare. They were pressed in very, very limited quantities. And at that particular point, that was really when Chris was working on 45s, much more than he was working on albums. The Lance Hayward one, the first Lance Hayward one, came about because he was dragged in to see Lance play at the Half Moon by his cousin, Barbara Cuddy. Barbara Cuddy at one point ran Island, the Island offices in Manhattan. That was the first time I met her going over there. Anyway, and it was her father who ran the Half Moon. Chris got to see them, had a couple of rums too many that night, and basically said, "You know what, I'd love to record you." Next time he saw them, he was asked, "When are you going to record us?"
Right.
And that's how the whole thing began.
And I'm looking at the cover now of that Lance Hayward, A Half Moon there, and there he is with the grand piano on the beach.
That's volume 2, isn't it? It's just gorgeous. And there's a palm tree, isn't it? The band are all set up on the sand, there are people swimming in the background. And that's part of the real attraction, I think, as Dave was saying, for us, it's particularly in Britain, was that it was so exotic and warm and tropical, wasn't it? Romantic, the whole idea of Island Records.
Yeah, absolutely. But that's exactly what they did. And they lifted the piano out of the bar and they walked it onto the beach.
Absolutely extraordinary.
I mean,
It is.
why not? That's what we need for the album cover shot, so why not?
So he was also the young Chris Blackwell, on Jamaica. He was also involved in one of the things that brought Jamaica into international prominence was, of course, Dr. No.
Absolutely.
The film.
Well,
go on.
His mother, Blanche Blackwell, was, I suppose, now known as Ian Fleming's muse. Whether there was a proper full-scale relationship, who knows, probably. And through Blanche's connection with Ian Fleming, then Chris was offered a job as scout, or location scout, it should be said, for the film. I spent some time with him earlier this year, and he told me this wonderful story that he was in the cutting room. I think it's called the cutting room or the viewing room or whatever it is room, with Cubby Broccoli and who's the other guy?
Harry Saltzman.
Yeah.
Right. And it was just the three of them in there, and they were the first people to see the rushes come out of Ursula Andress walking up the beach, and there is Bond kind of waiting for her. And he said at that moment, they then both rang London and said, we need more money. We now have a film. Up to that point, they didn't feel they had a film.
I thought that was such an interesting thing because it says so much about the film business. That is, one shot can make a film, can't it?
I know. But the other interesting thing for me was that Connery and Ursula Andress didn't bother to actually attend that particular screening.
Right. Really? Oh, well. Yeah. So tell us how kind of reggae finds its way into the mix, which it obviously does very early on.
We haven't really got to reggae. I suppose we have kind of in the 45s, but it starts with, it goes way back into calypso, and then there's the advent of ska, blue beat ska, rocksteady, and then reggae. So it's a process as opposed to it being straight into something like that.
Right, so I'm looking now at a cover of Byron Lee and the Dragonaires, Caribbean Joyrides.
I know.
This is 1964. Yeah. Tell us about this.
Well, Byron Lee and the Dragonaires were actually a kind of more a cabaret band than they were anything else. So the sleeves probably are better than the music. The music's okay, but the covers on those, and we actually discovered there was a third variant, which was the Australian cover, and somebody that I came across. I mean, it's a wonderful thing that you come across all these strange people, not strange, but just amazing people on the internet, and they offer you, I've got a copy of this. If you want to include it, then include it. And that's how the third cover came through. But I mean, it's graphically, it's probably more exciting than the actual music.
Right.
We should ask, actually, were there any records that you couldn't get hold of? They're just too rare and difficult to find?
There's 3 or 4 that I don't have in my own archive. The Ornette, Harold McNair with Ornette Coleman's Sidemen album, I don't have. I would love to, but I can't justify spending anything up to 1,500 quid on one piece of album vinyl.
It doesn't make any sense.
I mean, it's just unbelievably rare. I'm trying to think of the other ones. I've got the vinyl, but I don't have the sleeve for the first Owen Gray. I mean, that's how odd these kind of things are. But at the same time, there's a small collector community who are obsessive, and I suppose I could be counted as being obsessive.
Yeah.
And if something has a different cover, then you tend to pick it up.
Yeah. There's a wonderful cover to the Birth of Ska album, which we should just drop in actually from 1964. It's just beautiful. Little line drawing of a couple dancing on top of the word ska, Were those,
but it was never released.
Yeah. It was never released. No, it was never released. Yeah.
It was pressed up to white label. I've got the white label. I've got the cover, but it never came out. And it's just fantastic. Just a fantastic album.
Why wasn't it released?
Who knows? I mean, stuff like that, honestly and truly, is lost to the mist of time.
Yeah.
I mean, not everybody's alive, don't forget, who was working there at that time. I mean, David Betteridge is a mine of information. But, I asked him the exact same question, and he kind of looked at me blankly, and he said it was 50-something years ago. How the hell am I going to remember that?
Yeah,
why wasn't it released? I don't know.
One of my favorite bits in the book, I haven't got it in front of me, but is it John James? There's a guy, there's a record put out in the late 60s with an attractive lady on the front of it. And you actually ask Chris Blackwell, David Betteridge, all the people who ran Ireland at the time, say, do you remember anything about this? And they all go, no memory whatsoever. Can't tell you anything about it. She's nice, though. I thought that's so telling. You know what I mean? Because it gives you an idea of the kind of it's the chaos of a small record company, particularly in those days. They did what they could do, didn't they?
Yeah, absolutely. It started out, the first interview I did on that particular album, and it's it's a black and white sleeve, and I should be able to tell you immediately what the name of the artiste is. Bob Bell, he said to me something along the lines of, I've no idea why we put it out. It's all in Italian. I can't remember it. Betteridge couldn't remember it at all. He just stared at it and looked at me blankly. And then I asked Tim Clark, and Tim said to me, he said, I remember it, but that's all I remember.
Yeah.
Which I thought was fantastic. And then I couldn't not ask CB. And he kind of looked at me totally blank, and he went, I've honestly not a clue. But he said, the girl's really pretty, though.
There you go. But of course, it's the fate of all this stuff that there's more known about all this stuff now, 50 years later, than was known at the time, isn't it? Because you got people like you and, no doubt people all over the world and completists and discogs or whatever. The amount of information is just growing all the time, isn't it?
Well, it is, but I think it's also really important that it's not left to, and I'm not going to knock Wikipedia, but I think it's really important that something like this is done, and it's done properly, whereby you actually have all the accurate information that goes alongside it. So you have the amusing little tale of the album we've just been talking about. But then there's also the fact that you read up about, such and such an album was released on this date. You actually look the actual day up, and it was a Sunday. Well, how on earth was it released on a Sunday? Yeah. And I personally find things like that, when we're not at Cat Stevens yet, because that starts with volume 2. But if you look up the Cat Stevens album release date, they're all wrong. The first 3 are wrong, plain wrong. How can that be? It should never be.
Well, I suppose so. Yeah, but the record business is a very much vaguer business in those days than it subsequently became, didn't it? Really, working out exactly when these things were can be quite hard. But anyway,
I suppose. But to me, it's kind of important that because sooner or later we're all going to pop our clogs, aren't we? And
I'm not, Neil.
No, of course not.
Speak for yourself.
Speak for yourself.
No, but the point I'm trying to get at is that there won't be, in time to come, there won't be anybody who remembers.
No.
And therefore, our children's children will look at this and go, and there's no information. There should be.
It's true. You are to Island Records like Mark Lewison to the Beatles, actually.
Well, that's probably the most amazing compliment I've ever had. Thank you. Wow.
So then we're going into the mid 60s, and then Ireland is starting to sell records into the UK, and it's selling them initially to people from the Caribbean who've moved here, and there's still there is clearly a very strong market for ska, and then subsequently reggae and so forth.
Yep, absolutely, and that's exactly how it worked. So you had this is when Chris had done the deal with all the producers, most of the producers in Jamaica. It's all pretty well known. And he was selling records out of the back of his car. So it was him and David Bettridge at that time. They divided up London between them. David did mainly the south, and CB did the north and the West End. They weren't getting any records played on the radio. Virtually nothing was being looked at on in the press. So it was literally hand to mouth existence. And then, of course, Millie came
What were the
along.
big sellers that transformed the business for him?
Oh, the big album sellers would have been the Sue Story, volumes 1, 2, and eventually 3, Club Scar 67, Club Scar 68. Those, in terms of the albums, the first big 45, believe it or not, would have been probably Roy C.
Right.
Shotgun Wedding.
Shotgun Wedding, of course. Was that a top 10 record? Was it?
Was it
a top 10 record? It was no.
number 7, if I remember.
Oh, right.
rightly.
There you go. Right,
Yeah, and that was just before the World Cup in 1966.
Right. But obviously, as you mentioned,
buying it.
I do actually. But also, as you referred to, My Boy Lollipop was obviously absolutely transformational.
Yeah, I mean, the story behind it is well known, but it was licensed to Fontana. I think that's probably one of his most important decisions ever, because he was aware it was 1 minute 58. I think it ran out at. The first time you heard it, you knew it was a hit. But he was savvy enough not to actually go, you know what, we have our little label, we can put it out.
We'd do it ourselves, yeah.
It would have floored everybody and everything. It wouldn't have happened. It wouldn't have been the hit that it became.
And it was an enormous hit. And then he did something a bit similar with the Spencer Davis Group, didn't he?
Very
because
much so.
That again went to Fontana. It wasn't under the Island label, even though they were his
Absolutely.
signing.
There was a guy called Jack Baverstock who the deal was done with. And although the first 4 Spencer Davis 45s weren't the big hits that eventually they then later had.
So, but then moving from Spencer Davis to Traffic, this is 66, 67. And this is the first time you start to become aware of the Island label and the Island brand.
Well, it became pink. The label became pink. It went from, red and white, which was the bow tie label. And the reason for it moving to the pink label was because, and again, I quote Chris, it was that there was nothing Jamaican, remotely Jamaican, with something that had a pink label to it.
So I'm looking here at the Traffic, the spread in the book of the single of "Here We Go Around the Mulberry Bush" and the 4 members of Traffic on the left here, making their way through a farmer's field. I can remember what a big deal this was. That this was one of the first times that you were being deliberately shown the supposed creative process visually before you heard the results. Oh, look, Traffic. Steve Winwood's formed a group, and they've gone off to a cottage. And everybody who read the NME and the Melody Maker or the Record Mirror in those days knew about the cottage before they'd heard any of the records, really.
Yeah.
Do you think was Chris Blackwell aware of that, building this mystique?
I don't think he's ever been asked the question, and I don't think at that point in time that people thought in that kind of way. That the long game wasn't there, really.
No, it probably wasn't deliberate. It wasn't a piece of marketing. It probably wasn't deliberate, was it?
In terms of a piece of marketing, I don't think the word marketing had even been thought.
No. I'm sure you're right.
There's a lovely bit in your introduction where I think you're on a school camping trip and you're in Aston Tyrrell and you're right by the cottage and you meet up. You actually go and visit the cottage, don't you? Isn't that right?
what happened was that, yes, it was a Duke of Edinburgh's thing where you were dropped off at point A and then you had to walk to point B, but you had to camp overnight. And we were on the edge of the Berkshire Downs. And David, you're right. Everybody knew about this fabled thing, the cottage. And anyway, so I'm there with a couple of chums and we're walking along this little lane, up a hill, down the other side. Car comes hurtling past. And I kind of looked at it and I thought, hold on a minute, those faces are really, really familiar. And I didn't really think any more about it other than I told my friends who I thought had just kind of hurtled past in this car and they kind of guffawed loudly. Anyway, so we get to the end of this lane where it petered out into what could only be described as a track and barely a track at that. And it was a kind of you could either go right or you could go straight on. And the one the track that went straight on was less defined than the one that went to the right. So I said, well, look, what we need to do is let's go up there. And, we're kind of roughly heading in the right direction. We had compasses and maps and all this, ordnance survey stuff. Anyway, after about half a mile, I suppose, something like, there was a copse on the right-hand side. And then it opened out and there was this white sort of building, old farm cottages. It's never a farmhouse. It was 2 farm cottages. And there was a pink van parked outside. And
there you go.
Zodiac that had gone past us.
They're not agricultural workers.
No.
Yep. The pink van had the traffic logo on the side of it. And it was like, shit,
it's impossibly thrilling. It really is. The Holy Grail.
Well, no, it was then, what do we do? Do we go knock on the door? So we did.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And Albert Heaton, who's died now, he was the main traffic roadie at the time. He was the guy who we first met, or who I first met.
It's fantastic how much material there is. You've got pages and pages of pictures from Aston Tyrrell of them playing in the house. In fact, that whole getting it together in the country thing was a really influential part of the rock music story, really.
Absolutely.
There was a huge amount. They must have realised how valuable it was, and they photographed it all the time.
Yeah, those pictures are incredibly important to the entire thing. I mean, the traffic and the cottage, as I've kind of put it, it's not just traffic, it's the cottage, because it's such an important formative part, are the first, and Steve, obviously, a first cornerstone of Ireland. But those pictures that you've seen have never been seen before, or the bulk of them have never been seen before. And I've basically tracked John Benton Harris down, and amazingly, he invited me to where he lives in the south of London, and he just sat there. Here, I've got this, I've got that, I've got that. Just incredible.
Absolutely. So he was a photographer, was he?
He was the photographer who took those initial early pictures of traffic, and he did the Mr. Fantasy album cover as well. But that's pretty much what anybody has ever seen. But the other pictures in and around the cottage, Steve playing the double neck guitar, them rehearsing inside, them playing inside. Everybody's used to the Barry Wenzel picture, but that was taken, a year later.
Right.
68. So these are just extraordinary.
I'm looking now at a spread which got Jethro Tull, digging in their kind of strange agricultural garb. Opposite a page of some of my favorite stuff in this book is just the old semi-display ads from the Melody Maker
it's absolutely lovely.
See, if you go to the marquee, and this is September the 1st, 1968, you can see the nice, supported by Yes, I think, Jethro Tull with Love Sculpture, Dream Police with Kippington Lodge, of course, Nick Lowe in Kippington Lodge, I think.
Yep.
The Taste, not Taste, The Taste. I think it's really important. Keith Hartley, Jeff Beck, and Red Light District. Now, and Fairport Convention, what's really interesting, that's a week of the marquee in 1968. There's only one group there that's forgotten. There's Red Light District.
Yeah.
It's extraordinary, really, isn't it?
It's absolutely astonishing.
When you think of it in those terms, yes. I think those adverts are incredibly important because they also contextually set the whole thing in its own place.
This is it. They always say that I'm going to make that as one of my pet theories about magazines. You don't just read the content, you read the context at the same time.
Yeah.
And that's what you can see here. You got, I don't know where this ad appeared, but Jethro Tull appeared at the Roundhouse on 2nd of November by kind permission of the Marquee Club, where they appear next on the 26th of November.
Because in those days, you couldn't play a gig within, 3 miles of where you'd played the week before or something along those lines.
I love it.
I mean, Jethro Tull, you have to thank Spooky Tooth for Jethro Tull appearing on Ireland, because what happened was
it Gary Wright saw them?
There's a kind of debate about
Chris?
whether it was Gary or whether it was Kelly. And because Kelly was kind of a good friend, I kind of side with him on it. But anyway, what happened was that on Wages Day was Friday, and all the bands and the acts would go into Oxford Street, 155.
Well, and they actually got a cash in an envelope, didn't they?
Yeah, literally. That was Wages Day. And then Chris had this thing whereby if you see anybody out on your travels, out on the road, then tell me about them. And whoever it was from the Spookies said, we saw this guy and he plays flute and he stands on one leg.
That'll do.
That sounds gimmicky enough for me.
And went and tracked him down. I mean, how bizarre is that?
Who were huge sellers for them, weren't they? I mean, that was a major.
Yeah. Oh, they were utterly
the
breakthrough for everybody. They
was.
Yeah.
Because they were the first of these acts to really make it in America, weren't they, Jethro Tull? Because they went and they worked there like crazy, more than anybody else did.
Yep. And do you know who interviewed them probably more than anybody? Nick Logan.
Yeah, probably. He
might
did.
keep quiet about it now.
It's always a joy for me going through old copies of the enemy. And you go, there's Nick interviewing, Captain Beefheart in 1967 or something like that.
Or reviewing Fairport Convention at the
absolutely. You did what there was to do. Now, you mentioned Spooky Tooth. It did fascinate me that they went through such transformations so quickly, didn't they?
Because I do have something to show you.
Go on.
Talking of Spooky, I kind of figured that the Spookies might actually appear. So I don't know whether you can actually see this.
Oh, it's just Island Head and Dope.
I'll read it to you.
Read it out.
It's going to appear as a full page in Volume 2. It's dated January 29th, 1969. Memo to Spooky Tooth from Chris Blackwell. The weekly cash advance of £30 each to members of the group depends on gigs being done as booked. This is because this figure is only secured if a sufficient total value of work is actually earned every month. In future, £10 will be deducted from each member for each gig missed. Basically, they're being fined for not turning up for gigs.
Fair enough.
But how brilliant is that?
That's the Spooky Tooth work ethic for you.
Well, they were a bit of a handful.
Chris Blackwell was so involved, wasn't he? Because it was Chris Blackwell who I think brought in Gary Wright. I think realizing that this was a brilliant singer and this was a group that weren't quite going anywhere, and he was very, very good, wasn't he, at making those connections and producing commercial packages.
Well, what happened was that Traffic's first dates in Scandinavia, they were supported by a group called the Times or New York Times. And Gary was the singer and keyboard player. So he brought the group to London, fired the group, kept Gary, then brought Art, as they were at that time, which was Kelly, Mike Harrison, Luther, and Greg Ridley, and basically said, you will work with you and you will work with you. And that's how Spooky Tooth evolved. And then they got the name Spooky Tooth from a pen friend of Gary's, who suggested all these different names. Kelly told me he hated the name. In fact, all the rest of them hated the name, but it worked. And
It's so of its time. Actually, art a feature in the book too, I think, with the supernatural fairy tales, most amazing.
Well, this is it. There were the VIPs, then there were art, then there was Spooky Tooth within a really short space of time, weren't they?
Yeah,
they were...
absolutely.
Yeah.
And then within the book, there's also it's called The Chapter of Life, which is this promo booklet that Guy Stevens had done. And I think that the one that we have in the book is actually probably the only one that exists. And that's in Kelly's wife's possession now.
One of the things that really surprised me about the book, one of the things I really liked about the book, was that it has the whole story of Ireland in there, and including stuff I never knew was anything to do with Ireland, such as Why Was He Born So Beautiful, the Rugby Songs album, and the various albums of adult humour. This was presumably just a business opportunity that they saw could be useful to them.
I think it was a business opportunity. I think it was an opportunity to sell some records. But more importantly, it actually saved Ireland's bacon because Chris was away for a year or so working with Millie. She was going around the world. Obviously, My Boy Lollipop related. Came back. Ireland were not in great shape. The Rugby Songs albums, 2 of which came out, and they actually sold so many copies that it actually propped the coffers up. It's as simple as that. But Chris said he recorded the first of the albums. In fact, he probably recorded both of them, and they were probably both done at the same time. And it was at the old Olympic Studios, not the one in Barnes, but the one that predates the one in that part of London. And he got banned from the original Olympic because the studio ended up awash with beer.
No.
I mean, literally awash with beer.
No.
There was a piano at one end of the studio. There were crates upon crates upon crates of beer at the other end. And the gap in between was like a sort of a mill stream of beer.
So this was them recording whoever it was, the Jockstrap Ensemble or whatever. And there's an album, isn't there, of bawdy British ballads. There's a record called Music to Strip By. It was absolutely, I'm really glad you put all that stuff in because I just didn't know anything about it. It was so funny to think that it might have been, it might have been the rugby songs or risque comedienne Belle Bath or whatever, whose success gave them the money to sign Hapsash and the coloured coat or whatever. I don't know. I mean, it's just an extraordinary moment.
Yeah. Well, it wouldn't happen in a day and age like we have now, would it?
No, not remotely. No.
Definitely.
It's great that's been.
But I suppose it just indicates it's always the problem that independent labels have, that you can have one hit, but then it might be followed by a real fallow period, and you've got to keep paying out money. So go on.
I was just going to say the one thing I didn't know until I spoke to Tom Hayes. Tom Hayes ended up as Ireland's sort of eminence grise. He was the wise man and director of business affairs. At that time, he was one of the sales guys on the road because Ireland was beginning to expand. And he said, "Oh, you want to talk to me about the Rugby Songs albums?" And I kind of went, "Yeah, if I may." And he went, "That gave us our first gold disc."
I mean,
incredible.
I mean, who knew that?
No, I'm sure. They probably didn't make a song and dance about it at the time. So
probably not.
So that's merely 1959 to 1968.
Yeah.
So as you say, the next one, 69 to 70.
Yeah.
So then you're getting into, I don't know, King Crimson and all kinds of things.
Well,
and
you
Cat
start
Stevens.
with the Cat Stevens, of course, the samplers, the ones that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
Nice Enough to Eat, you can all join in. And then the bumpers, the double sampler, which I don't think, frankly, has ever been bettered as a track listing. I honestly don't think that's been bettered.
They were such important, influential records, those. Absolutely.
Well, I mean, the other part of it for what we're doing is that people are gradually kind of, if you like, coming on board, and suddenly they're kind of going, you know what, I have got this as a nice little artifact. Maybe this will be useful for you. So I was speaking to Paul Samuel Smith a while ago. He, oddly enough, lives on the other side of France to us. And he said, would you like all my track sheets for all the Cat Stevens albums I recorded?
Wow.
And so they will be there illustratively. Nobody's seen stuff like this. I mean, a lot of this stuff, in my view, should be in a museum somewhere.
Well, except you got to find a museum, haven't you? Really, that's not.
Yeah, but you know what I mean by that.
Not easy.
It needs to be preserved.
Well, look, so there's merely the first volume, which is, can be yours if you can lift it. But
it does. It weighs a ton.
I've got it on a solid flat surface in front of me, which is the best place. I find I put it in the front. I put it in the desk in the front window, and as I'm looking out the front window, I just read a bit of it, and found it absolutely fascinating. Journey into the past.
It's such a labour of love. I know it's an old cliche, but the idea that you tracked down all those people, that you collected all those bits of ephemera, you got all those record sleeves, you made all those phone calls, and you pulled it all together. How long does that take? How many years you were working on Volume 1?
15 years.
Really?
Yeah.
15 years you started?
Yeah.
That long? My God.
Yeah. Well, it started, but I didn't really know what I was starting. And it was actually only really when Kelly died that I remember vividly standing there at the funeral, looking at this coffin that none of us expected to see and thinking, shit, if I don't actually get on with this and start properly talking to people, then, people will be dead. It's as simple as that. You're not going to get those ever again. So, I mean, first person I interviewed was Winwood. I rang Steve up and said, look, this is what I'm going to do. Are you prepared to sit and sort of talk about things that, not the normal kind of questions? And he kind of hummed and heard, and he went, yeah, all right, okay. So we met for lunch halfway between his place, and this is when I was living in the UK. And we just sat and talked, and I think he gave a more full kind of interview than he'd ever done before. So there's a huge heap of stuff I had from him. And then I thought, right, okay, I've got that. And then I interviewed the guy who did, you remember the LP album?
Yes.
Oh, LP.
LP.
Yeah.
LP. Big P on the front. Yeah.
Okay, so I interviewed him, and that was just on the phone. He lives, oddly enough, very close to where Gareth Mankiewicz lives in Cornwall now.
Right.
And he told me they shot the real peas that they shot, and they had to have, he called it a pea roadie, because the peas under the lights were going off.
Hey, this is it?
Creating a smell.
Yeah.
So they had to send somebody to wherever it was, the market in London nearby where they were shooting, and get a fresh bag of peas.
I'm so glad someone is doing things in this level of detail.
This is why food photography is a very legitimate area of photography, isn't it? Because food goes off, seriously. As people specialise in shooting.
It has to look warm.
Absolutely. Well, look, it's a fantastic piece of work, Neil, and we won't stop you from getting on with Volume 2 and 3 and 4 and whatever, because we'll be looking forward to seeing those in due course. Nice to talk to you.